The bellows breathed like a patient animal, a slow inhale that made the forge coals gather their strength, then an exhale that sent orange light spilling over floorboards scarred by years of iron-shod hooves and men's boots. Rhea Calder stood, just inside the doorway, palms tingling from the heat, chin lifted against a mid-morning wind that swept fine grit down from the flats. She held a ledger against her ribs and watched the man everyone in Brindle Mesa called the Silent Smith. Hale. Forrester worked the bar he'd just drawn from the fire. He didn't speak. That much had always been true. Some folks said he had nothing to say. Others, harsher, said he couldn't. Rhea had already learned that the people most eager to explain a man were the ones who hadn't bothered to look at him. The way Hale's shoulders rolled when he hammered, the way he angled his feet to catch balance without thought, the way his eyes measured distance, a nail's head width, a horseshoe's curve, the temper of a plough tine, had told her he was a man who tracked the world through little truths and made bigger truths from them. It made sense to her. The world was mostly small facts you gathered until they formed something you could stand on. Morning, she offered, though she knew he would answer with a nod at most. It wasn't a complaint. Rhea had grown to like his silence in the same way she liked the sound of water carrying itself under ice, steady and certain if you listened long enough. He dipped the bar, steam boiling from the trough, and the hiss wrapped around her like a shawl. His face was unremarkable until you watched it a while. Broad brow, a faint white line on his cheek like a poorly erased pencil mark, dark hair too long at his collar because he cut it himself, and didn't care if it looked right so long as it stayed out of his eyes while he worked. Those eyes were watchful but not wary. Not today, not yet. Rhea turned a page of her ledger. I've got 2 wagon rims for the Pleasance boys, a kitchen rack for Mrs. Moffat, and... She glanced at the note. And a thing with teeth that'll bite wood better than a mule bites oats. Their words, not mine. Hale's mouth moved in what, on another man, would have been a smile. He set the bar on the anvil, turned it under the hammer until it began to remember a circle. When he paused, he lifted his chin to the workbench where a sketch lay, a saw blade with a clever offset to its teeth and a notch that would fit the spindle on the carpenter's new contraption. Rhea had seen the drawing there yesterday. He was building the thing before anyone had finished deciding what to call it. You always know what they want before they know how to ask, she said half to herself. He quenched again, then used the tongs to point at the shelf near the door, where she always left the small envelopes, orders, bills, the town's paper spool of gossip wound tight until someone tugged. She set the ledger on the stool, found the envelope with his name written in her tidy hand, and hesitated. Her stomach did that thing it had taken to doing lately, a slow turn like a wagon wheel in mud, as if it were trying to warn her before. Her mind could reach for the thought. Stage brought news from the south, she said. 3 towns hit in as many weeks. Same crew, same sign left behind, a hawk feather tied to a nail, stuck in a door frame like a token. She waited. Cade Morrow's name was on folks' tongues again. Hale's hammer paused mid-air without finishing the stroke. Then it continued, as if the pause had never happened, but Rhea had seen it. She kept her voice level. Sheriff Harlan says we'll keep our heads low and our doors barred if they ride this way. It's a good plan on paper. This time, the nod came. It was the sort of nod you could wedge a hope into and it would hold. Rhea tucked the envelope under the edge of his vise so he'd see it later. I'll put the rims on my tab for now, she said. Mr. Pleasance always pays late in harvest, but he pays. She glanced down at the ledger, at the columns she kept stolid and true, because when everything else in her life went sideways, numbers stayed plumb. I'm short a month at my own place, she added, as if it were just another item to inventory. The feed store's been slow. Folks keep fewer animals when they fear guns more than winter. Hale tilted the rim he'd been forming and eyed its curve. He stripped off his glove and reached without looking for the coin box near the shelf, where he kept finished odds and ends bound for customers. She shook her head before he could raise the lid. "Don't you dare," she said gently. "You already give me a better price than you give anyone." He put the glove back on. The bellows shuddered and sighed. Rhea let the heat sink into her bones. She would not tell him the rest of it, the way Mr. Bellamy at the bank had begun, looking at her fingers instead of her face when she signed her name, the way he'd said, smiling thin, that a woman alone ought to be careful of promises she couldn't keep when storms came. The truth was, she had Gabe to think of, her 13-year-old brother who slept stretched too long across their narrow bed and woke hungry no matter how many biscuits she put in him, and a mother buried under a cottonwood hill facing west. If the bank turned her out, she'd wedge them both into the loft at the feed store and pretend it was enough. She was good at pretending in ways that didn't hurt anyone. "Rhea?" The voice came from outside, a whistle through the open door. Liddy, Moffat in her sunbonnet, cheeks flushed with the sort of worry that made people handle each other too carefully, as if everyone might break at a breath. "Sheriff's posted a notice," Liddy said when Rhea stepped out into the wind. "Town meeting at noon. He says there's talk Morrow's crew is seen along the river road." Rhea thanked her and looked back over her shoulder into the forge. Hale had raised his head, and his gaze had flicked, in that small, telling way, toward the open rafters where a black rifle case sat among bundles of old scrap leather. Dust lay thick on the case. She had never seen him touch it. "I'll be at the meeting," Rhea told him, standing framed by the light so he could read her mouth, if he preferred. "You should come." He went back to work. She pretended she hadn't seen the rifle case at all. The square in front of the courthouse looked like a church had stood up and walked outdoors and decided to preach to everyone at once. Sheriff Harlan Mott stood on the steps with his hat pushed back, sun carving trenches into his brow. He was the sort of man who started sentences with the word "folks" and meant it. He had 3 deputies behind him, and if you pressed them together shoulder to shoulder, Rhea doubted they'd make one confident lawman among them. That wasn't a criticism so much as a fact. Brindle Mesa had not needed more until now. "Folks," Sheriff Harlan said, proving Rhea right, "we keep ourselves good by keeping our heads cool. There ain't no prize for meeting a storm half a mile out if you haven't got a barn to run back to. Keep doors barred at dusk. Keep children by your knees. Don't go looking for trouble you can't answer." A man in the crowd, Briggs Leary, whose temper had a short rope and a sharp hook, spat and muttered, "Answers a rifle to a wolf's chest." Others nodded, because belief is a thing that travels on visible lines. The set of a jaw, the tilt of a hat, the way a hand rests easy or not at a man's belt. Sheriff Harlan lifted both palms. "If Morrow comes, we'll be ready to greet him. Quiet-like, with doors shut and lamps out. He can ride through a ghost town if he pleases and not get choked by a single word." He glanced up just once, quick as a blink, past the crowd and toward the far corner where Rhea knew Hale often stood at the edges of such gatherings. She followed the look out of habit, but didn't spot him. The place he sometimes took under the shadow of Pilgrim's livery was empty. Liddy Moffat's little girl tugged at Rhea's skirt and held up a rag doll with one eye. "Do bad men have mamas?" the girl asked. Rhea crouched, her bones reminding her of the sacks she'd carried up and down store steps since spring. "Sometimes they do," she said. "Sometimes their mamas teach 'em better, and they forget anyway. That's nothing to do with us. Our job is to keep each other, Little Spring." Gabe, who'd slipped beside her out of nowhere as he was wont to do, like a ferret learning to be a fox, leaned against her hip. "I can sleep at the store tonight," he said, trying to sound taller with it, "in case someone tries the back door." "You can sleep in your bed," Rhea said, gentler than the words. "Briggs Leary's dog can watch the store. He's got a better growl than you." Gabe grinned, unoffended. There had been a time when Rhea had worried he was too soft, too distracted by beetles and birds to grasp what the world asked of a boy who would soon be a man. Lately, lines had begun to form around his mouth in ways that made her swear silently. At time, he still had the look of a boy who would run toward a wounded thing because the running mattered more than what he could do once he got there. She wanted to keep that in him as long as she could. "Rhea!" Sheriff Harlan's voice cut through thoughts like a blade through cloth. He'd moved through the crowd to her with a purpose that made people step aside, because even if he wasn't the best lawman who'd ever worn a star, he wore it honestly, and that counted for something. "Word is the River Road had 3 riders seen at dawn," he said low, for her and no one else. "Hard to swear to faces in dust, but one of the horses had a pale mane, and a saddlecloth described. Plain as a preacher's truth. I sent Jonah Purvis to ride north for help, but it'll be 3 days if the wind is with him, and his horse doesn't turn an ankle." Rhea nodded. "Hale?" she asked without asking. "I told him," Harlan said. If Hale had nodded in return, Rhea knew that'd be the end of that speech. Men like Hale and Harlan stored words like winter beans and only opened a jar when they had to. "Bellamy's been asking after your notes," Harlan added, acknowledging what Rhea didn't say. He let the words sit between them without judgment. "If he pushes too hard, you send him to my door to cool his boots." "Thank you," Rhea said, and meant it. Pride wasn't worth much if you let it haul you past your own allies. "I'll settle with Bellamy." "No doubt," the sheriff said. "You always do." The meeting broke in small knots, the way people step away from news as if distance could make it less true. Rhea walked along the boardwalk with Gabe. She half expected to find Hale shadowing the edges of the crowd. He wasn't there. When she reached the corner, she looked down the alley toward his forge. Smoke braided up into the hard blue sky, and she felt her shoulders loosen a fraction. The world stuttered when men like him left their posts. Afternoon fell heavy as a blanket. The heat settled under Rhea's collar and made her wish for rain that would not come. She sold nails by the handful at the feed store, cut lengths of rope with a knife that had belonged to her father, and told a mean rooster that pecked a man's shins to go home and consider its choices. At 2:30, Briggs Leary barged in and demanded gunpowder on the house for the good of the town, and Rhea, who believed in the good of the town as a creed, told him she believed more in the safety of all its houses. He swore and threw a $50 at the counter hard enough to spin. She caught it on its edge and set it down flat. "You'll get your barrel," she said, "but you'll sign for it. That way, when you put a hole in your shed or your neighbor's, Patience will know exactly which man to thank." The corners of Briggs's mouth twitched, and some of the fight fell out of his shoulders. "Can't say as how I don't deserve that," he grumbled. He signed. At 3, Rhea started toward the forge with a list of deliveries and a mason jar of lemonade, because silence deserved small kindnesses too. She turned the corner into the alley between Pilgrim's livery and the smithy and stopped. The yard beyond Hale's open doors held 3 horses she did not recognize, one with a pale mane and a blue saddlecloth whose threadbare fleur-de-lis tried hard to recall its youth. Her mouth dried. She turned the way she'd come and pressed, a palm lightly against Gabe's chest before he could ask what was wrong. "Go home," she whispered. He opened his mouth, curiosity and stubbornness wrestling in it, then closed it when he saw her eyes. He went. Rhea quickened her step without breaking into a run, because running called attention, and attention was the last thing she could afford to grant a bad thing before she understood its angles. She set the lemonade on a barrel. She stepped into the forge with her chin high and her ledger tucked like a shield. 4 men crowded the open space. The one closest to the anvil had sandy hair that curled despite the dust, and a smile that didn't mean it. He wore a pistol, low and easy, and his hat sat like a crown he'd stolen and dared anyone to take back. Cade Morrow himself. His crew fanned around him the way dogs give a wolf room to move. One had a scar that pulled his mouth tight. Another had fingers stained like tobacco from something darker. The fourth was barely grown, and already trying to look older by how he stood. Hale held the tongs in one hand and a horseshoe in the other, the iron cooling in air he had no control over anymore. His calm moved over the room like invisible furniture Rhea wanted to grab hold of. "This your Smith?" Cade asked her, as if she'd had the good fortune to own him. "Quiet fella. I told him we require shoes for 3 horses with more miles in 'em than they ought to have. He gave me a look that said he works for coin, not conversation. Fair enough. But then he kept not speaking, and it offended my sensibilities." "Not speaking offends your sensibilities," Rhea said, steady. "But robbing folk and leaving feathers like you're a schoolboy playing at leaving a mark doesn't." Cade's smile sharpened. He tipped his head toward her ledger. "What do you keep in there, miss?" "Calder," she supplied. "And numbers." "Numbers," he echoed thoughtfully, like a man rolling a new word in his mouth to determine if he could afford it. "I favor stories to numbers. They make better noise. Name's Cade Morrow. I do some traveling for work." "I know your name," she said. "Do you know his?" Cade nodded toward Hale. "Because I do. I don't forget faces. I don't forget hands." Rhea made her face brave. "He's the best smith in 2 days." "Right. He works fast when he's not fetched into talk he didn't ask for." Cade clicked his tongue. "I like you." He took a step closer. "I like your tone almost as much as I like how you're not shaking even when your breath wants you to." He looked back at Hale. "What is it with you quiet ones? You invite my curiosity. You make me wonder if the softness is all on the—" Outside, Hale set the shoe on the anvil and lifted the hammer. "Ah," Cade said lightly. "You go back to hammering, and I'll go back to asking. That's a kind of dance. I'm partial to dances when I lead." He nodded at his youngest man, the one trying on adulthood like a coat. "Evan," Cade said, "bet you a bottle of red clover that this fella flinches if you slap the quench trough with your gun barrel. Go on." The boy grinned, nervous and eager. He swung his revolver lightly and cracked the tin rim. The noise rose like a startled bird. Hale didn't flinch. The hammer rose and fell, just as it had before. Cade's interest sharpened the way a hawk's does when a rabbit doesn't run. He stepped closer to Hale, close enough that Rhea could see damp dust on the tips of his bootlaces. "When a man doesn't flinch," he mused, "either he's too dumb to know he should, or he's seen louder things up close and decided this ain't worth the blink." He looked at Hale's hands. "Smith's hands. Scar on the palm there says you've been telling Hot Iron to behave since you were young enough to learn to listen. That sort of scar has a cousin." He pointed lazily at Hale's hip where Rhea's breath snagged. The hem of his apron didn't fall quite smooth. The shape beneath, hidden, was a lie of cloth over hard truth. She'd never noticed before. She had never had a reason to look. That hard. Cade smiled without any kindness. "Guns leave cousins on palms too," he said, "the way a grip bites a man who squeezes like he means it. You carry a weapon under that leather, Smith." Hale lifted the horseshoe with tongs and turned to the quench. He set the iron down in the water as if the world were not spinning faster than it had a minute ago. Rhea breathed through her nose. "He carries nails and a file," she said, "and a town that eats bread better when his work holds its wagons together." Cade's gaze slid from Hale to her and back again. He tilted his head. "Tell me a story," he said, soft. "Tell me he's the sort who'd let a woman stand between him and 4 guns and not bother to even put a hand out to keep her gentle." Hale did nothing so obvious as move. He set the tongs down and reached for the hammer's handle again, his wrist rotating with such unremarkable grace that Rhea almost missed it, the way his thumb brushed along the haft, testing for a burr, for a splinter that might catch its speed. She felt the hairs rise along her forearms. It was the smallest thing, the sort of thing that wouldn't matter to anyone who hadn't spent years watching hands living at work. To Rhea, who'd learned to catch a lie at the corner of a man's eye before his mouth got around to telling. The gesture said. I'm telling you I am listening. Quiet, Cade murmured as if to himself in delight, but not empty. He took another step. He was close enough now that the heat from the forge began to dry the sheen at his throat. You know what makes me itch? He asked lightly. A man who won't say who he is when I ask. It makes me think I should give him a name so I can call him by it later in the dark. He glanced at his men. What would you call him? Dumb, said the scarred one. Mute, said the tobacco-stained. Coward, the youngest tried, his voice going high on the final consonant like he wasn't sure if the word had an ending. Cade's mouth folded into something like pity. No, he said, a teacher's chide. Cowards talk a lot. They fill up rooms with their names as if sound would turn them into men. The worst cowards are the loudest. He set his hat on the peg near the door with a kind of ceremony. Smith, he said quietly, I'm going to give you a chance to humor me so I don't get bored. Because bored men do messy things. I'm going to ask you a child's question. Do you know who I am? Ale looked at him the way a man looks at a fence post he's considering moving. Nothing dramatic, just the weight of attention placed deliberately upon a simple thing until it becomes a problem to solve. Cade smiled as if he'd been flattered. He knows. Good. That saves us time. He took a coin from his pocket and flicked it with his thumb, a neat, bright motion. The coin clinked against the anvil horn, spun once, and fell into Hale's palm where it had no business going if the man hadn't planned to catch it. Cade watched the catch, watched the way the thick fingers closed without hurry. There's a fella some miles south with a bullet stitched clean through his ear, he said conversationally. He told me a story after I bought him a whiskey, said there was a man once who shot a hornet out of the air because it wouldn't let his horse have peace, said that man didn't say a single word after. Cade's smile lingered. I like stories. They don't have to be true to be useful, but that one, it felt like a ledger entry, not a tall tale. Rhea had heard that story too. She'd filed it under nonsense where she put anything that made the world tilt. She pulled it back, out and set it in front of her to reconsider. Cade turned, as if he'd remembered Rhea's presence, only to enjoy it anew. He took 2 steps and stood close enough to smell her soap. You married? He asked without blinking. No, Rhea said, and willed her pulse quiet in her throat. Good, he said. I dislike taking things from husbands. They always want to talk about it after. He reached and took her ledger. He thumbed through it and whistled. You keep a town in these pages. That's a kind of power most men ignore until it shuts their doors for them. He found her name in the list of debtors with a sum that made her mouth taste like pennies. You owe the bank, he observed. I could pay that if you like. No, thank you, she said, and understood with a clarity that found her spine. That she had just refused something larger than a sum. She'd refused to let him draw a line through her name with his pen. Cade's eyebrows rose in polite surprise. People don't tell me no, he said mildly, as if reporting a fact about terns migrating. They try sometimes, they practice, but they don't do it when it counts. He handed the ledger back with one finger pressed to the page where her debt lived. It's a pity when a store shutters, the street loses half its light. He looked toward the doorway. Sheriff, he called, you out there remembering how to breathe? The shape in the doorway made Rhea's stomach twist and fight itself. Sheriff Harlan stood jaw tight, hand on the butt of his sidearm, his hat low to hide righteous thoughts that didn't have a plan yet. Afternoon, Harlan said, neutral as a fence post. Afternoon, Cade replied, cheerful as a blue jay. I was just remarking to this fine woman that her store keeps more souls fed than any sermon. It would grieve me to see it empty. He smiled. You should raise her wages. It's her store, Harlan said. Cade laughed. Oh, then raise the town. Give her business by decree. He waved a hand as if he had no interest in manners. We're going to shoe these horses, he continued, turning to Hale. You're going to do it fast enough that I don't remember boredom. You don't have to talk. I'll do that part. Hale went to work. There was a quiet to watching. Him that scratched an itch, Rhea didn't know she'd carried since she was small. Some people made noise, some people made work. She liked the kind that left something better behind it than it found. He turned a shoe, tested it against the horse's hoof, willow quick and effortless, filed a whisper off a nail's point. He moved a little slower than usual, but it took Rhea several minutes to notice. Not out of fear. It was the sort of slow that came from building a map from scratch as you walked. He was measuring faces and distances and where the light fell if you moved half a step. He was making a ledger of a room the way she made one of a town. Cade leaned against a post and told a story about a man who'd wagered his wedding ring on whether Cade could put a bullet through the hole of a wagon wheel at 30 paces. The story had the ring ending up on Cade's finger. Rhea watched Harlan watch the room and wished she could be two places at once, at Hale's shoulder and by the sheriff's side. It didn't take turn toward danger so much as it slid. The young one, Evan, decided his courage needed feeding. He drew in a long breath, like it might make his lungs into a barrel, and stepped toward Rhea. "Tell me something," he said, trying casual and ending up skinny with it. "Tell me you can look a man in the eye when you speak." Rhea met his gaze the way she would meet a stray dog's, steady, not challenging. "You're a boy," she said softly enough that only he and the heat heard it. "You've got time to decide what sort of man you'll be. Don't spend it proving something to men who will leave you when you die." His face went red and then white. Pride shoved its way through adolescence. He grabbed at her ledger, and when she held it close to keep ink from turning into his hands, he reached instead for her wrist. The motion that followed happened so naturally it seemed inevitable. Hale's hammer rose, and the way it rose could have been about work, except that it stopped mid-air, and the direction of his shoulder changed. His left foot shifted a thumb width, and then the hammer came down, not on Evan's hand, but on the wooden handle of the quench trough ladle, which popped up like a lever and struck the boy's knuckles with a smart crack. Evan yelped and let go of Rhea. "See there," Cade said, delighted, clapping once. "Now we're entertaining each other. The quiet man knows how to speak where it matters." He held up both hands as Harlan half drew. "Sheriff, leave your iron where it sleeps. I'll consider myself insulted if you ruin the show." "Your show's over," Harlan said, "and your horses can go to hell barefoot." Cade sighed dramatically. "Everybody in this town takes things too serious. Let me lighten it. Smith, help me with the problem." He reached into the back pocket of one of his men and pulled out a green bottle of some farmer's illicit pride. "That fence out there," Cade said, nodding toward the yard. "I don't like it. It leans. Leaning things humiliate me. Put this on the top rail at 20 paces. I bet our silent friend here can knock it off with one shot without breaking. The glass, feat of skill, a town carnival before a storm." Rhea's stomach colded. "No." The word came out before she knew she'd made it. "You can drink or break or leave, but you cannot play with our men like children's toys." Cade put the bottle on the rail anyway and backed away, counting lazy steps. He reached the 20. "If he breaks it," he said, "I'll pay your note at the bank. If he doesn't, I'll take something else I want." "What do you want?" Rhea asked, though she knew better than to ask a man like that for the shape of his hunger. Cade's eyes swept the forge and came back to her. "Manners," he said, as if that were the same as saying, "you." Harlan stepped fully into the doorway, revolver drawn now despite talk. Men gathered behind him, unsure of whether bravery tasted like iron or like ash. Cade's crew shifted. The air changed the way air does just before thunder learns its name. Hale's hand dropped to his side and returned with the revolver as quiet as a sigh. Rhea had not seen him draw. She had been watching him and had not seen the motion. The gun sat in his palm, like it belonged there in the way a hammer belonged, and the way a pen belonged in Rhea's hand when figures needed setting straight. His face didn't harden. It clarified. He walked to the yard, each step measured to keep his breath where it needed to be. He didn't glance at Rhea when he passed her, but she felt something move between them, a line drawn taut and ringing. Cade sprawled his arms as if to bless a choir. "Everyone come witness," he called, and the men in the street did, because people witness when a rumor comes to the stage. Hale stopped. He looked at the bottle on the rail. He looked at the horse beside it, and then at the barrel of Cade's man standing nearest the animal, because Hale had already done the math of a ricochet that might find flesh. He turned his head a fraction, enough for Rhea to understand that. He was counting the exact distance between his barrel and the bone in a thigh that would cripple a man without ending him. Cade's smile laid itself thin across his teeth. "No rushing," he said. "We have all the time I'll permit." He flicked a glance at Rhea. "Don't you love it when a man takes his time?" Hale lifted the revolver to eye level. He didn't sight the way bragging men sight. With one, I pinched like they were trying to tell luck where to wait. He brought both eyes to bear and made his breath the measure. The yard went quiet. Somewhere, a baby cried and was hushed like a hymn turned to a hum. "Stop," Rhea said. It came, out small, a hopeful treachery. "You don't have to prove anything to men who already decided what they'll believe." Hale's jaw flexed once. Cade leaned forward, hungry as a dog at a bone. "There's the music," Cade murmured. "I've never had a man play a gun. And for me, go on, Smith, give us the first note." Hale's thumb slid the hammer back with a sound like a knuckle rapping at a closed door. He paused on the cock, and the pause felt like a cliff where people gathered to guess at falling. Hale's revolver spoke in a single breath. The yard's quiet shattered into a sharp report that cracked off the livery wall and sent pigeons lifting like torn paper into the bright sky. Rhea's body braced for glass and blood. She could not stop her hands from rising half an inch, the way a mother's do when a child stumbles. The bottle did not break. It jumped. Hale had not aimed for the glass at all. He'd put lead into the top rail, a hand's width to Evan's right, at an angle Rhea would not have known to imagine, so the bullet chewed the wood and spat a chip bright as a tooth. The rail jolted. The bottle's base skated a finger's width and lost its argument with gravity. It slid, tipped and fell straight toward dirt. Rhea's breath locked. Hale was already moving. His offhand, broad palm, scar-pale against sun-browned skin, came up and caught the bottle by the neck as if he'd called it down from a shelf. He never took his eyes off Cade, not once. Not even when a ribbon of lemonade, shaken thin by the fall, slithered out under the cork and painted a wet line down his knuckles. No broken glass, no blood. The crowd's inhale came all at once. A single creature discovering it had survived itself. Sheriff Harlan's jaw moved, as if testing whether it still belonged to his face. Cade Morrow smiled as if someone had just whispered a secret that pleased him in a church pew. "There it is," he said softly, the two words laying down like a balm and an insult at once. He turned in a little circle, inviting Brindle Mesa to agree that it had seen a trick worth storying. "That's the sort of neatness I like. Clean edges, no mess to mop. Smith," he added without glancing back, "you can put your toy away." Hale set the bottle on the fence post with a tenderness that could have been mockery if it belonged to any other man. He thumbed the revolver's hammer down and rested it near his thigh. Rhea could not feel her feet. Only when Hale shifted and the sun took him in profile did she notice that his breath had never quickened. The steadiness woke something in her spine that had dozed since winter. Evan, red-faced and trying to convert humiliation into swagger, tugged his hat brim down as if he'd meant to tip the bottle himself all along. "I didn't blink," he announced, picking a fight with his own shame. "You did," Rhea said before she could decide not to. She heard the softness in her voice surprise him, and she let it stay. And that's all right. Blinking keeps eyes from burning. Cade's mouth tilted. She tells the truth. Easy, this one. He slid his gaze along the street and found Sheriff Harlan anchoring the doorway with the weight of his badge. Sheriff, a man could call this demonstration an end to our business for the day. We'll take our shoes, take our shadows, ride. Out and wave a feather behind us for your collections. You'll ride out, Harlan said, and you'll wave nothing. His voice was gentle, but the way he held his sidearm told a different weather. Leave the feathers north of the river. Men out here plant enough markers when they've no choice. We don't fancy souvenirs. Cade looked from the sheriff's gun to the sheriff's eyes and back again, like a man choosing between two roads that promised him the same thorn bush. You gonna make a law out of manners? He asked. Sometimes, Harlan said, manners are the only law people agree on. The men behind Cade shifted. Pike, the scar-lipped one whose smile never made it to his eyes, Sutter, with his nicotine fingers the color of bad tobacco, and Evan, who stood too square when afraid. The fourth man, the one who'd held his silence, so far grey at the temples, an old grief lodged in his posture, watched Hale with a confusion that wasn't curiosity. Recognition, Rhea thought, without a name to stick to it. Cade rolled his neck and let the theatrics fall off him like dust. All right, he said. Since we're making laws, here's mine. I don't leave a town without a story that justifies the trip. Today's story is... What? He spun lazily and pointed like a boy, choosing targets on a fence. Hale, Harlan, Rhea, the gathering of townsfolk heavy on the boardwalk. What makes the next place's whiskey taste better for being further away? He let his finger land on Rhea, the ledger lady, she who declines my charity like it's a sickness. Rhea kept her chin up and her hands still. Inside, something small wanted to shake. She set it down and told it to hush. You made a wager, she said. He met your conditions. Our business is done. Cade's smile shifted into something like admiration and then into edge. Our business, darling, begins where other people think it ends. It begins when pride speaks and keeps speaking until it has to sit down and drink water. He put a hand on his heart. But I'm a fair man. I'll trade. Your quiet friend there, he tipped his head at Hale, can keep his silence if he proves it to me. One more shot, something delicate. He gestured toward the forge yard gate. Its top bar held closed with two nails laid crosswise in a split of wood. Hit the left nail and leave the right untouched. Open the gate with the wind, and I'll declare myself entertained enough to keep my temper in its holster. Enough, Harlan said, stepping into the yard. You had your circus. Cade's hand fell lazily to his belt, not to his pistol, but to the knife sheathed there, like another kind of promise. And you had your sermon. Now I want a fireworks. Hale raised the revolver again, and a quiet gathered around the gathering. The peculiar hush of people preparing to brag later that they had watched calmness do something impossible. Rhea wanted to say no. Don't let him turn you into a story he can carry like a ribbon, but she also recognized with a cold clarity that refusing would give Cade a different tale he could make meaner with embellishment. Hale sighted not at the crossnails, but at the rusted hinge a foot beyond. He didn't move his feet. He didn't need to. He breathed. He pressed. The shot spat splinters from the gatepost. The wheel of the hinge shuddered, and the gate creaked open a hand's width. The left crossnail jumped and spun in place like a coin. The right stayed true. The wind, which had been sniffing around the corner of the yard undecided, put its shoulder into the wood and drew the gate wider so the yard gaped like a mouth. The horses in Cade's charge set their hooves square and blew. Cade clapped, a single sound sharp enough to carry and almost sincere. He looked at Rhea as if to ask if she'd seen it, if she'd put it in the correct column. She held his gaze without giving him the shape of an answer. All right, he said, brisk, as a storekeeper closing up. We're done being entertained. Pike Sutter, fetch the shoes. Evan, fetch my curiosity. His eyes cut to Hale. I want to know what the inside of your quiet sounds like. Leave him, Rhea said before Harlan could say the same with less use. You said finished. I said entertained. Cade's patience snapped like a sparrow's bone. He lifted a hand and Pike took 2 steps toward Hale, moving his gun like a man who'd learned to trust it as a grammar for all occasions. Hale didn't lift the revolver this time. He turned the hammer in his hand, caught the flat with his palm, and laid the gun on the edge of the anvil, where the light painted it plain. He picked up the tongs instead. The gesture did something to Cade that Rhea couldn't name. Anger flashed, but it wasn't the hot kind that erupts and cools. It was a fugitive flare from a deeper source, a man suddenly confronted with a thing he could not make into him. You lay it down when I speak? He asked softly. That's either submission or insult. Which one pays you better? Hale didn't answer. He dipped the shoe. Steam rose. Somewhere behind Rhea, a mother pulled her child closer. Somewhere to her right, Briggs Leary muttered a wish about dynamite that made her head snap his way, because a wish can turn into a deed if no one tends it. Cade, Harlan said, steel returning to his tone. Saddle. Now. Cade's smile returned, slow. Here's your trouble, lawman, he mused. You think every road forks into 2, do or don't. But there's a third wish, and it's the one I favor. It's the one where I do and you don't, because you have more to lose than I do. He let his gaze slide to Rhea, and then beyond her to the street where Gabe, disobedient and all courage, had drifted back into the crowd with his chin determined and his fists closed around nothing. Cade's attention snagged. He sniffed it, like a hound catches the edge of rabbit. Rhea saw the moment, the small tilt of Cade's head, and she stepped half a pace sideways to block his view of her brother without seeming to. She wished suddenly and fiercely for an ordinary hour, a basket of eggs, a laugh at the counter, somebody saying there was rain somewhere, to wash the powder out of this one. You, Cade said to her, soft with threat. Come here. No, Harlan said. Rhea swallowed, wetting a throat that had turned to rope. If I walk, she said, eyes on Cade, you walk those men out with me. Horses only. No guns on hips, no knives in boots. You and me in front. The town will measure your manners by your obedience. Cade's eyebrows teased upward. She bargains. He looked from her to Hale. Does she bargain for you too? Hale lifted the shoe, turned it, set it down again to take a fine shaving of steel off the inside curve. People's fear hummed like bees. Rhea could feel it in the root of her teeth. She wanted to put her hand flat on the anvil, as if a thing made straight could transmit courage to a human body. Walk with me, Cade said again. This time he let the hard come through. Rhea, Harlan warned. Rhea thought of how numbers orderly on a page gave people permission to rest. She thought of promises written in careful ink. She thought of Gabe's ridiculous ears, and of the way he still mumbled thank you to the tin plate before he ate beans like the plate required courtesy. In the street, the town gathered as if drawn by a sound only fear hears. The boardwalk boards complained under boots. A dog, unaware of human rules, wagged enthusiastic at everything, then tucked its tail under a bench when worry proved the word of the day. Earl Bellamy, neat as a ledger and pale as unspent paper, stood in the doorway of his bank with what he thought was a neutral expression. Rhea, who counted expressions as currency, saw the gleam behind his eyes. Calculation, not courage. She filed him correctly under liabilities. Cade led her to the center and stopped. "Neighbors," he called, as if trying on the word for size. "I'm a patient man. I don't come to take bread out of mouths. I don't burn the barn when I can climb into it and steal its eggs one at a time like a reasonable fox, but I do have appetites." He turned her gently to face the crowd, placing her like an object on a table. "This one refused my generosity. He said the word as if he were confessing to a priest. That put me in a pious mood. Now I want tithes. You want attention, Rhea said, and allowed a little contempt into it, because she was very, very tired of men who mistook hunger for destiny. It's smaller than you think. The grey-templed outlaw, not Pike, not Sutter, not Evan, laughed aloud at that, sudden and surprised. Cade shot him a glance. The man raised his palm like he'd been caught stealing seconds at supper. "Sorry," he said, not sounding sorry. It was accurate. He looked at Hale at the yard's edge again, without being able to quit. "I've seen him somewhere," he muttered, and Rhea watched the thought try to hatch behind his eyes and fail for lack of warmth. "Sheriff," Cade went on, abandoning generosity for control, "I'll take your gun for the hour and give it back when I'm finished making sure this place knows I visited." "You'll take nothing I don't throw in the road," Harlan said. Rhea lifted her chin another infinitesimal degree. "You said tithes," she said. "Fine. Take pride. That's the coin you came for. You already have some. You don't need mine." "You're brave," Cade said. "Brave's a version of foolish. I collect both." He gestured like a man introducing a theater show he had not rehearsed. "Here's my second law. If the smith can make a man's gun fall out of his hand without touching him, I'll ride. If he can't, I take something he values. His quiet, maybe. Or I take something you value." He slid a look at Gabe, whose attempt to be brave had moved him nearer to danger than thought could save him. Rhea's mouth said no without asking her. She stepped in front of her brother and felt him press against the back of her skirt like a second heartbeat. Hale walked out of the yard. Pike stayed tight to his shoulder, gloating ready at the chance to lay hands when skill failed. Hale stopped. 10 paces from Cade. He looked not at Cade, but at Sutter's revolver, indexed on the man's hip as if attention could loosen a screw. Sutter frowned at the scrutiny and shifted. The revolver's weight dragged forward half a finger's breadth. In its sagging holster, Hale lifted the gun. The sun found the steel and made a small star. He pulled the trigger and struck not metal or flesh, but the bell of the livery harness hanging on its peg 3 yards beyond Sutter. The bell rang with a clean, clear tone that swept the yard. The horse tethered to the post, twitched, sidestepped, and crashed its flank into Sutter's hip. Sutter startled, his hand jerked, his revolver tumbled graceless to the dirt. Cade's smile thinned to a blade edge. "Neatness is a habit with you." "Habit keeps men alive," Harlan said. Cade didn't look away from Hale. "So does hunger. Ask your ledger lady." "Ask your mother," Rhea said. The words leapt out of her before she got a hand on them. She hadn't thought of Cade Morrow's mother in her life, and did not care to now. But the sudden image of a woman somewhere who had once wiped blood off this man's scraped knees and had not managed to wash the ruin from him made her angrier than sense. A hush dropped like a blanket. Cade's eyes, which had done little but amuse themselves for a quarter hour, made a new shape, flat, lifeless. "Careful," he said softly. He took 2 gentle steps toward her, and the way he moved made people nearer the boardwalk take 2. Careful steps back. "My mother died facing east." The truth failed her, and so did every man offering it. He flicked his gaze to Hale. "Now your woman bleeds for your neatness." "She isn't my—" Hale began, and Rhea said, "I'm my own," over him, and the odd coincidence of 2 truths trying to occupy a single space made Cade blink. "Enough," Harlan said again, and Rhea realized with a jolt that his voice, steady upon itself, had been the town's last tether to whatever list of rules it used to carry. That tether had frayed to a single strand. Cade's head cocked. He seemed to be listening for something only he could hear. What he heard pleased him. "Here we are," he said. He lifted his fingers to his lips and whistled, 2 notes high and thin, the second a hand around the first. Rhea heard the answer before she saw them, hoofbeats blurred by dust, then sharp as hailstones. 3 riders came first, then 4, then another, all at a canter fast enough to raise the kind of dirt that made men squint rather than blink. The lead rider had a hawk feather tied at his collar with a ribbon. Feathers multiplied behind him, like a flock deciding which direction to turn. Cade didn't turn to face them. He watched Rhea watch them arrive. "I didn't ride alone," he said, "because I don't enjoy being outnumbered by laws." Harlan swore under his breath. "Inside," he ordered, not to Cade, but to everyone breathing Brindle Mesa's air. "Board your doors. Window shutters closed. Barn cats under beds if they'll go." He raised his voice without losing its color. "Go." The town moved. Men who had never run because walking had always been sufficient. Women who had never. Hurried because hurry had never brought anyone closer to flower. Children disappeared into skirts. A girl dropped her doll, and then bravely turned to pick it up because you don't leave faces in the dust, even if they're sewn on crooked. Cade made a half bow, as if awarding the sheriff his theatre. "Yes," he said, "hide. I like it better. When my audience peeks between fingers." Rhea didn't move. Cade was still within an arm's reach of her. If she stepped back, she would be stepping away from the thing she refused to put behind anyone else's body. She had decided on her feet when she'd walked out of the forge. She saw no reason to call that decision back, because dust wore feathers now. Gabe tugged her skirt. "Rhea," he whispered, small as the day he'd learned how to hold a spoon. "Please, go," she said. She didn't look at him because looking at a person is the same as holding them sometimes, and her hands were already full with stubbornness. "Home, now." Her voice's shape made obedience into a bridge, and he ran across it. She let the relief wash through and then away without ceremony. She would be grateful later. Now there was counting to do. "Sheriff," Hale said, and his rare deep, the shape of a creek running under ice, cut under and through the noise. Harlan turned. Hale's chin tipped toward the bank and then the feed store. People there, in basements, in rafters. The words fell awkwardly from a mouth that did not practice them, but the meaning was clean. Rhea didn't ask how he knew, where everyone had gone. He knew because he watched. Watching was a kind of prayer that became a map if you held it long enough. Harlan nodded once. "Briggs," he yelled without turning, "you get your barrels out of Rhea's back room. If one spark hits them, I'll mistake your feet for tinder." Briggs Leary, who had until this second looked like a man wanting to argue with God, flinched. "Yes, Sheriff." He bolted toward the feed store, and Rhea's heart went with him because gunpowder near greed burns faster than a match struck in summer. The riders swarmed the far end of the street, then fanned. This wasn't a raid, Rhea realized with a thin, sick feeling. It was a demonstration. Cade wanted the same thing Harlan wanted, compliance. Only the currency differed. "Bring me the ledger," Cade said without looking at Bellamy. "All of it." Bellamy, who had not yet decided whether he feared outlaw worse than debt, tried on courage and found it the wrong size. "It's locked," he said. "Keys are just metal," Cade replied. Bake was already headed up the bank steps with the ease of a man, climbing a gallows he'd known the height of in boyhood games. 2 shots later, the lock gave up its claim to the door. Rhea didn't know when she'd moved, but her body had repositioned itself between Cade and the bank without asking permission. It was a useless thing. She did not own the door. She did not own the safe inside. She owned tenuously the ledger of a town's daily mercies. Nails sold on credit, oats put aside for Widow Haskins's mare, a sack of flour for the Coles boy, who'd come in with eyes wide, and a story about spilled soup he'd not yet told his mother. She stood because standing is a truth that says, "I saw what you did to the shape of the world, and I did not sit for it." "Walk away," she told Cade. Cade smiled that sorrowless smile. "You make the ugliest words sound like blessing," he said. "No wonder the town follows your math." He lifted his chin at Hale. "Tell her to step aside." Hale said nothing. He holstered the revolver with a slow, careful movement that read, "To Rhea, like writing on water, quick to disappear if the wind changed." He stepped forward until he stood with his shoulder a breath from hers. He didn't touch her. He didn't need to. His nearness changed the way the air reported itself to her lungs. She felt her breath start to obey a steadier drum. "Fine," Cade said. He made a little shape with his mouth, as if abbreviating a prayer. "We'll skip the bank. I'll take what I came for." He extended his hand in an invitation that pretended to be gallant. "Speak," he said to Hale. "Just once. For me." Hale looked at the hand as if it were a misplaced tool, and Rhea wanted to laugh because the absurdity was so bright it nearly undid her fear. Cade Morrow, who had named himself a law of appetites, was asking the quietest man in Brindle Mesa to unravel himself for sport. It was like demanding Rain make a speech about gravity. "I'll pay for her note," Cade added lazily, as if an extra coin had rolled into his pocket, and he just remembered it belonged to someone else. "You don't like debts hanging on your lady's shins? I'll cut the rope for you." Rhea felt the offer hit the crowd like a thrown stone. People didn't mean to look at her and imagine her relief, but they did. She could feel their eyes like moths hitting a window. Her cheeks burned and then cooled. She wanted to stand on the boardwalk and announce to every house and every cat and every nail that she would not accept Cade Morrow's rescue if it came with a chain. But she also wanted, oh God, she wanted to stop waking at night to count out coins that still came up short. "Don't," she whispered. She didn't know whether to Hale or herself. Hale didn't let his gaze leave Cade. "No," he said. The word rolled out, rough-edged and clean. Cade's eyebrows shot up in delight. The town gasped, not because a man had declined the devil, but because the man had spoken. Hale didn't give anyone time to claim surprise. "We're done," he added, and the second word did something to Cade's mood that the first hadn't. It wasn't refusal, it was dismissal. Cade laughed, short and sharp. "You're done when I say so." Harlan moved then because the speech act had clarified the field the way lightning clarifies ridgelines. You didn't know hid there. "Deputies," he barked. "Positions." He had only 3 men. He called them like he had 30. Chaos found. Its moment like water finds a crack. Pike came out of the bank with a sack in his fist, and Sutter bent to recover his fallen revolver, and Evan, still smarting under ridicule, did the stupidest thing Rhea had ever seen a boy do. He lunged for her wrist again. The contact electrified the block. Hale moved like a hinge, made for a different door. He did not shoot the boy. He stepped, turned, caught Evan's forearm at the elbow, and walked the child's momentum into the dirt with a tenderness so severe Rhea felt her own bones learn a lesson. Evan's breath left him. He would carry a bruise the size of humility. Then everything, everyone, moved at once. A shot cracked from somewhere up the street. Rhea flinched and looked for a falling man. It was a warning into empty air. Another outlaw, a man with a beard like thistle and hands like shovels, tossed a lit match toward the livery's hay and missed by mercy. Briggs Leary stumbled out of her feed store, dragging a keg of powder like a man trying to pull a whale ashes. Through a window. "Help!" he wheezed. 2 boys ran to him without their mother's permission. The keg bumped down the steps, hit the street, rolled, and came to rest in a small miracle against a rut that held it like a cradle. Harlan raised his gun high and popped a shot straight into the air, the way a teacher claps to arrest a classroom storm. "Enough!" he shouted for the 3rd time, and made enough out of his voice to fill the word. "Stand down!" "Not yet," Cade said almost cheerfully. "We're finally making the music I came for." He lifted his own gun and fired, not at a person, not at the sky, but at the oil lamp hanging from Rhea's awning. The glass burst, oil fell like rain, flame licked the edge of the spill and learned what its body could be. Rhea moved without thinking. She snatched a wool saddle blanket from the hitch rail and slung it into the oil, smothering brightness that wanted to become blaze. She stamped. Heat kissed her shins with sloppy mouths. Smoke rose bitter and rapping. Cade watched her work and smiled with terrible fondness. "See," he told Harlan conversationally, "I don't have to burn a town to the foundation to own it. I just have to set it a task it can't finish." "Get water," Rhea called, and her voice carried like an order she'd been practicing. In her sleep, "Bucket line from the pump. 2 lines, 1 in, 1 back. Wet the blankets. If you see flame, don't feed it air. Smother it like a lie." Women ran then, skirts hitched, hands already reaching for buckets, as if the town had been waiting for someone to give a word it trusted. Liddy Moffat led. 3 older boys followed. A stooped man who had never been useful in a fight found himself useful now and glowed with the relief of it. Cade gestured idly with the muzzle of his gun, as if he were painting the afternoon. "You organize well," he observed, amused and thoughtful at once. "You could build a country on that voice." "Then I will," Rhea said, and didn't realize until the words had gone that she meant them, in whatever small way a woman can mean the word country when what she has is a feed store and a table and a handful of stubbornness. Hale had moved to the far end of the boardwalk as she spoke, putting himself between the bucket line and the nearest outlaw without standing in anyone's way. He did it like he did everything, simply as if standing in the correct place were a craft that required apprenticeship. Pike drifted toward him, grin still wrong on his face. "You've got a trick for every trick," Pike said, as if confessing. Admiration cost him less than it usually cost men who liked hurting to make coins spin. "I've got work," Hale said. Pike laughed. "So do I." He lifted his gun. Hale tilted his head, not to line up a shot, but as if listening for something the rest of them hadn't yet noticed. "Don't," he said. Pike did anyway. He squeezed. Hale wasn't there when the bullet arrived. He had moved 1 step sideways, into a space his body already knew. The bullet chewed wood where his chest had been, and the splinters flew into Pike's own face. He jerked back, cursing. The men behind him laughed the brittle laugh men make, when comedy saves them from recognizing fear. Hale did not retaliate. He kept shifting. The smallest adjustments, inches that changed angles, the kind of movement Rhea understood from years of carrying sacks without banging her hips against thresholds. He was saving himself in increments. Cade's gang had swarmed. To the bank now, 3 inside, 2 posted on the street like roosters on fence posts. Harlan and his deputies had set themselves to a different math. Angles, windows, cover. The town's boys ferried water, and the women smothered this flame and that one. And Rhea's world became little more than the wet weight of blankets and the count of breaths she could afford to spend on fear without falling behind on fire. "Keep low," Hale told her suddenly, his body appearing at her shoulder and vanishing again into the pattern before she could remark on the miracle of his placement. "Oil under the boards." "Then let's drown it," she said, and he nodded like a man signing a contract. They worked until the world narrowed to a dull roar of flame and the drum of boots and chain of buckets and a chorus of swears they'd apologized to God for later. More riders arrived and then left. Chaos breeds boredom faster than men imagine, and some of Cade's boys didn't care for organization they hadn't designed. Harlan held the center. Cade orchestrated the edges. In the lulls, Cade spoke in his conversational tone to whoever stood closest. "This is pleasant," he said at one such moment, and if there'd been a pie cooling on a sill, he would have asked for a slice, as if he hadn't lit the kitchen. "I like towns that remember what they're made of." "People," Rhea said, without looking at him, wringing a blanket with hands that were going to ache so fiercely tonight she would forget the ledger's sums and listen only to her bones. "Not stories you can carry." "Same thing," Cade said. "Different ink." Bellamy emerged from the bank, face whiter than any paper he had ever folded into contracts. Pike had the ledger under one arm, open in the other hand so it creaked. In protest. "Names," Pike sang. "Sums." He held the book like a preacher and recited like a man reading last rites. "Calder, Rhea." He looked up and grinned. "Oh, look at that." Rhea straightened, tired and angry, and emboldened by both. "Read it," she said, "loud. Let the town measure me in the open and not in whispers." If shame was to come, she would rather it walk in daylight than peck at her walls at night. Her hands shook, not with fear now, but with a rage too organized to waste itself on trembling. Pike made a show of licking a finger and turning the page. $48 and, he squinted, 37 cents. He looked at Cade. "What does dignity cost?" "Less than that," Cade said. "Usually," he flicked his gaze to Rhea, "I'll pay it. Put a blue ribbon on it." "No," Rhea said, flat as the anvil. "You don't get to call it yours." "Suit yourself," Cade said amiably. "I suit myself all the time." He lifted his hand, and the men who had been birthing minor chaos all afternoon gathered to him as if gravity had shifted around his boots. "Let's end the first act," he suggested. "We've had our carnival. We've had our kindnesses. We've had our near fires and our neat tricks. Now we go inside. And count. I'm bored outdoors." He meant the bank. Harlan saw it at the exact heartbeat Rhea did. They moved at once. Harlan to the bank steps with a speed his knees would punish him for later. Rhea to the pump to bark instructions that doubled the bucket line, because men inside a bank with guns are embers. A town must always assume can blow. Hail went somewhere Rhea couldn't follow. The roofline, she realized, when she lifted her chin and saw nothing but heat shimmer. He had climbed the back of the livery with cat care and then crossed, invisible to any eye-looking level. She had never seen him on a roof. He belonged up there the way a weather vane does, not decoration, but a thing you glance at without thinking, because it has always been above you, doing its quiet work. Cade's men pushed through the bank's door, and then the town heard a sound it had not heard in a decade. The safe being talked to by a man who knew its arithmetic better than the man who had bought it. Time stretched. Buckets passed. A child cried and was hushed, then cried again at a different pitch, not fear this time, but hunger, the body declaring its own laws. Rhea wished she could stop and put a biscuit in that mouth. She wanted the normalcy, with a violence that frightened her. Water on to boil, 3 ordinary chores executed in order, no men with feathers where the soul should be. A sharp crack split the bank's front window. Not a shot. Glass blown out by sound from inside. A shout followed, Pike's voice cursing somebody's clumsiness. Cade laughed once, the joy of a boy catching a frog. Then a different sound, not gun, not voice, a sharp, ringing whine like a horseshoe thrown deliberately against metal. Rhea pivoted just in time to see Hale at the bank's second-story window. He had used the livery's roofline as a highway, the bank's rainspout as a ladder, and the little decorative ledge that Bellamy had insisted upon when the place was built as a foothold for a quiet man with an argument to make. Hale's revolver appeared over the windowsill. 3 shots, fast, each meant not for flesh but for fixtures. The lamp chain under the ceiling, the flame fell and died in its own globe. The pulley rope by the safe, a shower of sparks. The brass bell over the door, a deafening clang that turned men's heads without asking nicely. Confusion bloomed like a struck match in a dry field. Harlan moved. 2 deputies moved with him, as if someone had remembered to wind them. The town held its breath, a mass of lungs tied to a single thread. Cade came out of the bank in a slow walk, hands away from his body the way men who want to pretend their guns don't run their days walk. He looked up at the window where Hale had been and smiled with a kind of paternal pride that made Rhea want to hit him in the teeth with her ledger. "You're good," he called up. "I like good. It keeps me interested." He looked at Rhea again, as if they were 2 people at a picnic, whose conversation kept being interrupted by weather. He does all that for your dignity, Cade mused. What do you do for his? Rhea did not answer a man who asked questions like that. She turned back to the bucket line and made sure the path from pump to flame stayed clean and did not pass under 4 pairs of boots that could be tripped by accident into law. Cade's attention shifted one last time in the hour, and for the first time that day, Rhea saw the color of something like real impatience in him. He had pricked the town. It had bled morale, but not will. He had tugged at pride and seen it hold. He had burned and been smothered. "All right," he said, voice suddenly flat. "I'm done picking." He nodded to Pike. "Take the boy." Rhea's body knew what boy before her mind supplied the name. Gabe had disobeyed her one more time, God love him, and had run to the pump to help. Pike reached him before Rhea's mouth finished forming. The Nahale dropped from the bank window as if the ground had risen to meet him. The world compressed to a small, bright point, through which all the town's attention squeezed at once. Hale ran without looking careful now, not reckless, but released. Rhea had never seen him run. He covered the distance between the bank and the pump in a dozen long strides, and he did not raise his gun. He put his body between Pike's reaching hand and Gabe's shoulder, and he gave Pike the option to let the moment pass like thunder misses a hayfield. Pike, being Pike, did not take it. He struck. Hale took the blow on his forearm and answered with a different grammar. His elbow found Pike's ribs. His boot found Pike's ankle. Pike stumbled a step that turned into 2, and then a fall that found the edge of the horse trough with the sort of intimate finality that leaves a man too winded to manufacture rage. The crowd made a sound Rhea could not name, and did not try to. Gabe bolted like a rabbit toward her, and she caught him by the shoulders and turned him behind her as if she were the door and he were the wind. Cade watched the exchange with that interest again, as if his hunger had found a new recipe. "Enough," he said, but he said it not to stop the fighting. He said it because he'd thought of something else he wanted. His eyes slid past Rhea, past Hale, to the feed store threshold where the oil had slicked wood earlier and where damp wool now lay, like defiance. "You run a tidy shop," he told Rhea. "Let's see how tidy it stays when I make a mess you can't fold." Before anyone could read the new shape of the day, Cade fired. Not at a person, at a lantern hung on a hook by her door, one she had spared because light keeps fear from multiplying when women count the till at dusk. The glass burst. Flame fell, found oil, found the edge of wool that had dried in sun faster than she'd guessed. It put its tongue down and tasted everything. "Buckets!" Rhea shouted, and her voice broke into the day like a bell someone had been lazy about ringing. "Now!" The blanket whooshed and went from ember to mouth. The flame ran under the board, like a lit fuse, and then lifted its head inside the store, in a line that made the hair at Rhea's neck seize and hold on. She saw it move toward the back room in a path that had nothing to do with wind and everything to do with how buildings remember the breath of air that keeps them alive. She saw it find the stacked sacks, and then the shelf where lamp oil kept. Its quiet rose, and then, God keep us, the kegs Briggs hadn't yet dragged out. She leapt without finishing the thought, boots skidding on heat-slick boards. Hale's hand closed on her shoulder in warning, and then let go, because he knew better than to try to hold her tied back with fingers. She grabbed the wool and smothered the path nearest her, but flame is a map reader with its own ideas. It had another route. It took it. It slipped under the counter she'd built the day she took the keys and kissed the cool shadow where a barrel sat and left a wet-looking line there, like an eager child dragging a finger through molasses. Rhea saw it. Then she saw the thin, bright tongue of fire reach toward black powder in a curving invitation, and she understood, with a clarity that knocked her breath down to the basement, that if that tongue met that barrel, half the street would jump out of its skin and never put it on the same way again. She lunged. Her palms slapped hot wood. Her lungs clawed air that wasn't air. Someone screamed her name. It might have been Gabe. It might have been God. Hale's shadow fell over her, taller than flame, and his hand found a thing she had not known she would be grateful for, a bucket, cold and full and heavy on its own account. He threw. The flame hissed and bit and tried to live in the steam. The thin, bright line shrank back from the barrel's belly like a snake denied milk. For a heartbeat, the town breathed again, for a heartbeat. Then Cade laughed. The sound had no delight left in it. "New game," he said, and pulled from his coat a little wax-paper-wrapped packet the size of a palm, a fuse capped with a twist of something dull and grey. He struck a match on his boot heel and let the tiny flame lick the fuse until it caught and began to eat. Rhea's stomach lifted and turned. Cade tossed the packet underhand through the feed store door, a lazy lob that would have been playful. If it had been a biscuit, it landed where the floorboards gapped into a dark seam. The fuse sputtered and vanished beneath. Rhea's whole body went cold. She did not think. She threw herself toward the seam, toward the crawling whisper of light. She jammed her fingers into the gap and felt splinters bite. She reached blind. Pain lit her knuckles. The fuse burned somewhere in the darkness under her store, the crawl space where they kept nothing and everything. She grabbed air and came up with nothing. Again. Today on the show where diving sound punched the world. A white-blue bloom lifted the counter like a breath and hurled it backward. Heat bit Rhea's cheek as if flame had teeth. The front window burst outward, coughing splinters and glass into the street where men threw up arms too late to mean anything. The floor popped under Rhea's boots, planks lifting and slamming back like the town had a heartbeat you could stand on. Her ears filled with a tin bell's scream. For a second, all sound was light. Then the world crawled back through a tunnel, the slap of a bucket hitting the threshold, a horse bawling at the wrong kind of thunder, someone's prayer she didn't recognize until she realized it was her own. Hale's body hit hers an instant after the light. He'd moved when the flame had kissed the keg, a single stride like an answer, and thrown himself over her and the barrel both, the wool blanket between. He'd smothered what could be smothered and taken the slap of the air that couldn't. Be tamed on his back. The keg had not blown full. The seam had spit and banged and made ruin of wood without finding its breath entirely. His breath found her ear. Warm, real, pending. "Gabe." Her voice sounded like it belonged to a stranger whose throat had never learned how to speak. "Here," her brother coughed, somewhere near her knees, small and furious at the world for daring to throw her. "I'm here." "Stay down," she said. She wasn't sure he could hear her through the metal noise rattling both their bones, but his hand wrapped her ankle like an oath. Smoke rolled low, looking for ways to become itself more full. Rhea forced her body onto elbows and felt heat claw. Her palms threw grit. The counter had dislocated and lay like a felled tree, its back drawers vomited up in a fan of receipts and string. A ledger page drifted in the hot air and tried to show her a number she had balanced last spring. She let it go. Hale pushed himself off her carefully and pulled the blanket with him. It smoked where it had signed its name against the heat. His shirt stuck to his shoulder blade in a dark page of burned flesh. He didn't look at it. He looked. "For the next fire, back room," Rhea rasped, coughing the words into the wool of her own sleeve, where the smoke sting could be filtered down to something the lungs allowed. The door to the storeroom hung crooked, its latch stuttering in its keep. Flame licked at its edges where lamp oil had splashed. The keg that had spit lay on its side, blackened at the seam, still listening for excuses to continue. She and Hale moved as one without the luxury of a plan. He kicked the ruined keg like a man breaking the grip of a bad habit and sent it spinning into a wet patch she hadn't noticed she'd made with all the bucket work. The sizzle made hope right itself on her tongue for the first time in a minute. "Hook," she said. Hale found one, an iron billhook she used to lift grain sacks, a familiar weight in unfamiliar war. He used it to drag a smoldering crate away from the good kegs, and she shoved a fresh blanket over the glowing place and leaned with all her weight until the glow turned to steam and the steam turned to stink. The feed store had never smelled. So much like the inside of a storm. Outside, boots pounded, buckets kept coming, a blessing measured in sloshing rhythm. She could not see the street for the smoke. She could feel it. The street had a shape like a long table, and you learned the placement of its dishes by living beside it. She pictured Harlan on the steps of the bank, every rule he knew rearranged in his hands to make a barrier that might work. She pictured Cade's teeth. "Out," Hale said, voice quiet in the wrongness, a deep note under the racket. It wasn't command, it was weather. "Out, Rhea." "We finish this," she coughed. He lifted his chin at the doorway. Smoke lay across it like a tired animal. Out, then back. Alive. It was a math she could argue with only if she lied. She did not lie to men whose backs burned, saving her ledger and her skin in the same motion. "Gabe," she called. "With me." His hand left her ankle and found fabric farther up. "Now." They went low as salamanders under the smokes, belly and out into a world that felt both too big and too small. The sky had the clean look it gets after a flash rain, but the rain had been fire, and the clean was a trick. The boardwalk had become a trench of buckets and knees and skirts, and above it all, Cade's boys paced like boredom had teeth. Cade himself stood center street, pistol loose at his thigh, hat brimming shade into eyes that enjoyed themselves when they shouldn't. He looked at Hale's back, and Rhea saw his gaze savor the dark wet on the shirt like a critic tastes a sauce. "2 tithes for 1 coin, he sighed. "You're worth my trip, Smith." "His name is Hale," Rhea said, and hadn't known she was going to give that truth to the day until it came out. Cade's eyebrows twitched at the gift. "Hale," he repeated mildly, as if rolling a glass of water around his palate, expecting wine, and pleased to find thirst answered anyway. Like a weather word, he dragged his attention to Rhea and measured her for blood or bravery. "And you're still standing in the middle of my road." "It's our road," she said, and didn't put heat on it. He respected coolness more. On the bank steps, Harlan had moved his deputies to either side and planted himself with his legs as if the street had been tipped and he was keeping the town from sliding into someone else's book. His hat was off, hair pasted to brow, eyes bright with a kind of ragged gratitude Rhea couldn't read yet. Gratitude that men hadn't died, that the bank still held, that he could still stand where he had chosen to stand. He caught Rhea's gaze long enough to throw a shape at her with his eyebrows. Hold, she held. "Where were we?" Cade mused, as if sifting the day's entertainment to find the next good bit. He twirled his pistol not like a show-off, but like a priest handling a sacrament he believed in. "Oh yes, I was teaching a town how much of itself I could take without reaching. Turns out..." He glanced at the feed store's broken front. "Quite a lot." "Not as much as you think," Rhea said because she couldn't help it. "People are not shelves." "Everything's a shelf if you want to stack enough fear on it," he replied, then, as if bored of his own philosophy, lifted his chin. "Pike!" he called lazily, not taking his eyes off Hale. "Bring me the boy!" The world sharpened to a blade in Rhea's chest. "No," she said, a thread barely crossing her throat but strong enough to hold a horse if she had to tie it to her voice. "No one!" Hale had already moved, not running now, not throwing himself. He walked forward, the slow stride of a man counting the distance not in feet but in other people's decisions. Cade watched him approach and smiled like the son he'd ordered for the day had arrived. "Here it comes," he murmured. "The neatness. Do I get a coin knocked from behind my ear next? A hat stitched to my head by a bullet that doesn't kiss skin?" He shook his head, as if regretting nothing louder than a clock. "No, I'm ready to be surprised more than that." Hale stopped where the street narrowed between the bank and the barber's. A breeze came through that place like a messenger and pulled the smoke up, giving all of them a breath that tasted like iron and distant rain. He set his feet. He didn't lift his gun yet. He let Cade come forward until the outlaws' leader stood 10 paces off, which is a sacrament distance of its own. "Duel?" Cade suggested, polite as a man offering another a seat. "Old rules, clean. The sheriff can count, the lady can watch, the town can wind its heart, and then unwind it slow." His smile hardened. "Winner writes what the day meant. Loser gets written." "No," Rhea said immediately, stomach ice and iron at once. "I won't have Brindle Mesa be a margin note in your sermon." Cade's head tilted. "You think you get to choose?" "I always do," she said, and then to Hale, only for him, "Don't let him pick the field." Hale's gaze slid her way and back, without meeting her eyes. His acknowledgments were always small, but she felt a thread connect anyway. He looked at Harlan, and then at the men standing ragged edges in a ragged day. "Terms," he said, and the people closest to him flinched like hearing a stone speak. Cade's smile thinned in pleasure. "Oh, now we talk. Say your prayers, Hale." He made the name sound like a toast to somebody else's health. "No one shoots but us," Hale said to Harlan without glancing away from Cade. "Men hold, women hold. Anyone fires who isn't named, I won't miss." The promise fell heavy as a thrown shoe on a green horse's back. The town shuddered, then steadied. "And when I win?" Cade prompted cheerfully. "You don't," Hale said. Cade laughed, delighted. "If you must be arrogant, be good at it. It's a courtesy." He lifted his pistol, rested it at his side like a gentleman's cane. "Sheriff," he called, "count. Be honest now. If you lie during a duel, the wind will remember." Harlan looked at Rhea and then at Hale. He had been a lawman too long to bless the decision, and too long to deny the use in a single point of focus in a day that wanted to be 12 disasters at once. He swallowed a lesson and lifted his hand, as if he were calling a class of rough children to the first lines of their letters. "One," he said. The street held its breath. The world narrowed to the space between two chests. 2. Cade's pistol twitched minutely, the practiced pulse of a man who knew where his hand would be before he told it, into the world of economic indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing, things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated, and how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you, with the help of some experts, to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. 3. Harlan's voice reached for the number and found the wrong one, because something else happened on the way there. Pike shifted. Not a big movement, a weight change. Rhea felt it through the plank under her boots and saw it in her, peripheral like a fly at the edge of a plate. Pike's gun, dropped earlier, had been retrieved. He dipped his shoulder to bring it up, cheating toward a shot that would turn a duel into a murder. "Pike!" Cade barked, angry for the first time at anything that wasn't boredom. "Hold!" Pike froze, the stupid animal of trying to please. 2 masters jerking the leash tied to his spine. Harlan did not say 3. The town did not need the number. The 2 men facing each other had already moved on and away from counting. Hale's arm lifted, not in the straight, theatrical line of a drawing, but in a curve that accounted for wind and for Cade's habit of dipping his chin half an inch as he drew, and for the way a man's wrist outpaces his elbow by the thickness of a coin. Cade drew like a man who believed a gun belonged in his hand, the way air belongs in lungs. He was very fast. He would have been the fastest man any town saw in a year if the other man in the street had been anyone else. They fired together. The street heard one shot and then another on top of it, as if the first had echoed immediately and chosen where to land. Cade's bullet cut the air where Hale's head had been a breath before. Hale had stepped into the place the wind had entered. A heartbeat earlier and let it hide him. His own shot took Cade's pistol, where the barrel met the frame. Steel screamed, sparks jumped. The gun bit Cade's hand like a dog disappointed in its owner and flew. Cade stared at his empty hand with the sadness of a boy who had dropped his father's tool. The town didn't move. Sometimes awe is a kind of paralysis. Rhea felt awe move through her and burn clean. She didn't worship men who shot better than other men. She worshipped the way a human being could read a day and choose a smaller wound for everyone. Hale had taken a killing clean out of the world and left behind embarrassment. Rhea preferred embarrassment to funerals. Cade didn't look embarrassed. He looked alive in a new way. His face opened and let in something that might have once been joy before it learned worse names. "Well," he said softly, his voice beautiful for the first time all day, "you are what I came for." He showed both hands to prove the loss, then curled the left, and Rhea saw too late what men who made their living on deception always carried. Another gun in another place. Cade's sleeve gave birth to a two-shot derringer that spat like a magpie. It came up fast with no need for elegance. "Hail!" Rhea shouted, useless, because when a thing begins it believes it already belongs to the world and refuses to listen. Hale didn't need her warning. He'd been watching Cade's shadow the whole time. It thickened on the dirt at the elbow where the second gun lived. The shadow told the truth, even when the man hadn't chosen to. Hale's shot was out of him before Cade's little barrel and could finish climbing. He hit the derringer's ejector rod. The gun spat itself open like a surprised mouth and dropped its two fat little cartridges to the dirt. One went off on the ground, spat heat into nobody, singed a clump of grass, and died of its own foolishness. Cade stood with two empty hands and no more tricks. His face changed, not to rage, not to fear, to something Rhea had not expected and didn't know where to put. Relief. "All right," he said, voice mild again, as if ordering eggs. "Then this story ends a different way." He lifted his hands shoulder high, palms out, fingers spread. "Sheriff, take what you think you can keep. You'll go in irons," Harlan said, surprise and caution wrestling in his throat. "Irons are metal," Cade replied. "I'm familiar." He didn't take his eyes off Hale. "Will you shoot me in the back if I try to walk?" he asked conversationally. "No," Hale said. "Because you're good?" Cade asked, curious. "Because she's watching," Hale said, and Rhea felt the heat that followed that simple truth tilt and then settle somewhere under her sternum where courage stores itself for winter. It should have been over then. It wasn't. Violence is an animal that hates being denied its meal. Sutter, who had been watching his day reduced to someone else's anecdote, lunged. He didn't go for Hale. He went for Gabe, because men like him learned young that the cleanest way to ruin a victory is to stain it with what it loves. Rhea didn't think. Her body wrote the next minute without letting her revise. She threw herself into Sutter's path, the way you throw yourself into a river to push a child toward air. Sutter's shoulder hit her ribs. She kept her feet because the boards under them consented to her need. She slammed her palm into the meat of his wrist the way Hale had taught a boy humility earlier. The pistol spilled to the dirt with the small, shocked sound a tool makes when it is reminded it is not a will. Sutter snarled and hit her. The punch landed sloppy, anger ahead of skill. She'd been hit harder by sacks of oats. She let the blow roll her and used the motion to get behind him. She hooked his knee with her boot and introduced him to the boards where so many men had learned other lessons today. Gabe grabbed the fallen pistol in clumsy hands and held it the way a boy holds a snake he isn't ready to understand. "No," Rhea said, not because she doubted him, but because she refused to give this day the shape of her brother as a shooter. He put it down on the far side of a trough, like she'd asked him to set a dish to dry. He was shaking, but it was a real thing a body does when it learns how to live through something. By then, the town had finished choosing. Maybe it had been choosing all along, and they had just not found the energy to announce it out loud. Men stepped from doorways with rope and irons, and the readiness that comes when fear has organized itself into a task list. Women set their buckets down and picked up dish towels and belts and anything that could tie wrists to responsibility. Harlan and both deputies were on Cade before Pike could decide whether to interrupt. Pike decided wrong. Hale didn't shoot him. He reached, turned the man's arm in a figure 8 that made even Rhea's shoulder ache to watch, and traded him gently to Ned Carrow, who ran the barbers and had steady hands even when hair wasn't under them. The church bell rang then, not because someone in the belfry had found the rope, but because Hale lifted his revolver and put a round through the bell's tongue to make it kiss the metal. The single hard peal ran out into the afternoon and came back with echoes that sounded like a spine being set. "Hands!" Harlan ordered Cade, breath under control now because his day had finally given him something he could call a sequence of events. Wrists. He put irons on the man who had tried to make his town into a story. The click of the cuffs had the quality of a period. "You'll be dead inside a week," Bellamy announced from the bank doorway, face thin with triumph he hadn't earned. "His men will come for him. Towns can't hold lightning in a jar." Rhea turned her head. "Earl," she said, bone-tired, "if you're looking to be useful, find a broom." Bellamy's mouth closed. He found a broom. Doc Green, who had worked quietly all this time in the uncertain lee of chaos, appeared at Hale's shoulder with a pair of scissors, a bottle, and the authority of a man who had cut plenty of shirts in his life, whether their owners agreed or not. "Off," he said, tugging at the burned fabric. Hale's jaw flexed, but he allowed it. The cloth peeled away from the blackened patch on his back like old wallpaper. Rhea would have swayed if there hadn't been a wall of stubbornness behind. "Her. You'll scar," the doctor said. "Badly." He poured something that made the hurt introduce a whole other alphabet to Hale's nerves. Hale didn't make a sound. Rhea made enough for both of them and then clamped her teeth on it, as if sound itself could insult a man's endurance. "Sit," Doc added. Hale remained standing until Rhea put her hand on his uninjured shoulder and made the word "sit" into her. "In place." He sat. He didn't look at her, but he had seen her, and that, she realized in a slow, relieved exhale, had been one of the day's quietest mercies. She had been seen by a man who paid attention correctly. "What now?" Cade asked, conversationally, from where Harlan and 2 others had him pinned to the idea of being finished. "You hang me in the morning for courage?" "No hangings," Harlan said. "We send for the circuit judge. You get a trial we can live with after." "Trials bore me," Cade said amiably. "They aren't for you," Rhea said. He turned his head and looked at her for a long time. His smile, when it came, was small and, God help her, real. "You organize a town like a choir," he said. "One of these days you'll make it sing something I like." "I'm not singing for you," she said, but she heard the future in his words, and it wasn't all threat. It was also a map. She would use it. The street tried on quiet. It didn't fit perfectly. There were still men to tie, bruises to ice, a feed store to put back together, glass to sweep, burns to salve, a bank ledger to close and balance, a sheriff to keep from falling over when his legs remembered what standing costs. But quiet came close enough to smell like rain. Rhea pressed Gabe's hair back from his forehead and told him he had been foolish and brave, both in the correct amounts, and that next time she expected him to be half as foolish and twice as brave in ways that didn't make her bones melt. He grinned too wide and hiccuped and wiped his eyes with his sleeve and pretended it was only smoke. She kissed his temple and was grateful for the lie. She stood and found Bellamy with his broom. "Earl," she said, gentler than he deserved, "you'll open a book." "What book?" he stammered. "Because when people like him are forced to be useful, they need instructions shaped like bridges. The one where we write what the town owes each other," she said. "Not to you, to each other." Rent for a roof for the widow who took 3 boys in without counting. Oats for a sheriff who kept standing when he should have sat. Nails for a smith who worked with his back on fire. We'll pay it, same as we pay you. On time, in coin and in bread. I'll hold the ledger. You'll hold your tongue. Bellamy looked like a man discovering a new form of arithmetic, one that counted people and therefore made more sense than any he'd used before. Yes, he said after a moment. All right. Good, she said. We'll start with me. She took her own ledger from where it had fallen and shaken its spine and fanned a few pages with her thumb. 48 and 37, she said. I'll pay it by harvest, half in cash, half in grain that keeps the town intact. She met his eyes, and when he would have objected on principle, she raised a hand. If you press me for it, faster the town will press back. Look at their hands. They're ready. Bellamy looked at the hands, rope-burned, bucket-raw, steady, and decided a new kind of prudence might serve him better than the old kind had. Harvest, he agreed, and when Rhea nodded, he beamed like a man who had just learned the difference. Between profit and security, they moved Cade and the worst of his men into the jail. It took 6 pairs of hands and all of Harlan's patience. Cade went like a man visiting a museum designed for him, approving of a cell's dimensions with a connoisseur's eye. I've slept worse, he commented, and Harlan, who had not, took it like a man who had learned today that pride can sleep anywhere if you make it tired enough. Wade Hawkins, the grey-templed outlaw who had laughed earlier, kept his distance, looking not at his leader but at Hale, as if he'd finally coaxed a lost name to the top of his mind. I seen you, he told Hale, tone not reverent but careful, like a man addressing weather. Not here, somewhere where a man's telling cost him less. Dodge? No. Abilene? No. He scratched his beard. You saved someone once. Or you didn't, and that not doing was the saving. Can't say which. Hale's face did not answer. His eyes flicked to Rhea and away. The glance said more. Not my story. Not today. Doc Green bound Hale's back in linen that would be washed. Later with care and boiled twice. He smeared a salve that smelled of pine and memory. You will not go back to work today, he ordered. And when Hale did not nod immediately, Doc added, I will tell her if you don't agree, jerking his head at Rhea. Hale nodded then. Good, Rhea said, because the forge can live. Without you for a morning. Brindle Mesa can't. She caught herself, embarrassed at how the sentence had turned on her tongue and landed where people could step on it. He didn't mock her. He didn't do anything at all. A small unclenching in her chest told her she'd expected laughter and been spared. Afternoon sagged into evening. The sky threw blue at everything and asked it to glow. The feed store looked like a ruin with a plan. The bank looked closed in the way a mouth looks after it's talked too much. The saloon finally dragged its doors open because some kinds of quiet are purchased with a glass. Children emerged like deer after a storm, walking on the sides of their feet and amazed that the world still held them. Rhea and Gabe swept glass and sorted salvage and wrote a new list on a clean page, because a day like this demands you make another column. She had invented a new column earlier without knowing she was doing it, what we owe each other. She liked the way the words sat on paper. They had weight but did not pull downward. Eat, Hale said from the doorway. He held out a tin plate, with bread and meat and a heel of cheese. He'd gotten it from somewhere that hadn't minded letting it go. She hadn't seen him leave to fetch it through all the work. He had a practice of appearing where you needed him, like a hand finding the next rung on a ladder in the dark. I will, she said, surprised to find the truth at her mouth. You too. He inclined his head. Gabe took the plate without ceremony and shoved half the bread into his face with a noise that might one day turn into a thank you when he had air. Harlan crossed the street like a man whose legs were borrowing time from tomorrow. He stopped in the doorway like a respect. He's singing in there, he reported, meaning Cade. I don't know the song, some border ballad about a horse that loved a man better than the man deserved. Men like him love what loves. Of them, Rhea said, wearier than any bed deserved to hold. It's the only math they can do. Harlan rubbed the heel of his hand over his eyes. The lines around his mouth had new stories in them. Circuit judge is 2 days if the mesquite doesn't decide to throw the trailer party. I sent Jonah Purvis. If his horse stays smart and his luck holds, we'll have law to point at when people like Bellamy get itchy about how long a man like Cade breathes in a public building. Bellamy will stay busy, Rhea said dryly. I gave him a new ledger and told him to stop thinking numbers were his to carry alone. Harlan blinked. You gave him what? A job he can do without hurting anyone, Rhea said. He needed one. I needed one. We hired each other. Harlan stared at her as if seeing for the first time the depth of her plan, then laughed, rough, grateful, unbelieving in parts. If I had half your sense, I'd have been governor by now. You've got exactly what this town needs, she said, and meant it. And what it doesn't have, it will build. He tipped his hat to her, then to Hale, and his eyes softened at the way the two of them stood near each other without touching, as if a hand had been held anyway. Night leaned in. Lamps found their places. The town gathered itself the way a woman gathers a shawl against a wind that has finally decided to be quiet. Rhea could have fallen into a chair and discovered she had bones after all. She did not sit. She went to the jail. Cade was at the bars, arms looped through, eyes bright with the sort of interest men find when a chessboard has pieces left on it worth moving. Miss Ledger, he greeted. I forgot to pay. I have some pride still in my pockets. He offered a coin through the bars, with an expression that would have been mocking if the coin hadn't been real. She didn't take it. You don't owe me coin, she said. If you've got debt, you owe it to men who built you. Pay them by not ruining the next boy you teach to carry you. He considered and then, absurdly, nodded like a student who had finally found the corner of a problem. You'll make a judge nervous one day, he said. Not because you'll argue the law, because you'll argue the ledger. I will argue food and roofs and wages, she said, and the way a town can be held by men who look out for their own hands first and still learn how to carry someone else's weight without dropping their own. If that makes a judge nervous, he should sit on a lower bench. Cade laughed, delighted. He looked beyond her to where Hale's shadow cut the lamplight into a shape the street recognized. He's good, Cade said softly. Not like a compliment, but like a fact on a weather map. Better than any man I've seen in a long time. I don't just mean the gun. I mean the way he puts himself where things break and makes them hold. He turned his gaze back to Rhea. I'm not sorry I came, he said. I will be sorry when I leave, because boredom follows jailers like dust follows boots. Find a different road, she said, and turned to go. At the door, she paused. Because sometimes charity should be a practice you do, even when the math says it won't buy much. Cade, he looked up, eyebrows lifted like a man expecting a curse or a benediction and ready to enjoy either. You don't have to be this version of yourself, she said. He smiled, tired and amused both. Lady, I've been many versions. This one fits best. Ask your Smith. He's wearing one that pinches, and it suits him anyway. That's the trick. Pretending a pinch is a hug, she almost argued. She didn't. She left him with his song and his wrists and his pride. Outside, Hale had taken a seat on the bench near the door. He sat the way men sit when their backs hurt too much to pretend otherwise. She sat beside him. She kept 3 inches between them, because 3 inches can be a covenant. They watched the street for a time and let their bodies learn not to expect another bang. You spoke today, she said finally, because silence deserved to be named when it made room for a word. He nodded. Why? She listened to the question leave her and hoped she hadn't asked the wrong kind. Something in his face moved, like a curtain in a window no one knew was open. Because I had to put the sound in the right place, he said. slowly, each word, like a shoe she had to help him tie. If I didn't, he would put it somewhere worse. She loved him in that moment, not the fat, easy love of romances that think 2 sentences can carry a house. A small, useful love. I will hold your words and not drop them. She didn't say any of that. She always knew which page to write on, and which to keep clean for later. You should sleep, she said, when the quiet began to ask when it would be allowed to become rest. He made a breath that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been tired. You won't, he said. I will when there's less to count, she answered. He turned his head, and in the lamplight his eyes had a softness that did not diminish them. I can watch, he said. You can count. Deal, she said, and let herself throat a sound that wasn't a sob or a laugh, but was friendly to both. They kept that bargain. He watched edges, doors, the line where jail met street, the place where the feed store had become a plan, and she counted names, debts, kind acts that needed remembering, men who had offered hands without asking for thanks, boys who had done foolishness bravely and would therefore live long enough to do bravery less foolishly next time. She counted coins, too, because bread costs what it costs even on the best days. When the night deepened and then softened, she wrote one more line under her new column, what we owe each other, today's balance. Kept. Morning wore its cleanest shirt. The town looked like a face after tears, puffy in places, tender around the edges, alive. The telegraph key at the depot clicked the judge's reply, 2 days, and then clicked again, with a message from places that had about them the feeling of a rumor. Cedar Ridge thanked Harlan for sending back the men who had taken it apart last week, intact, alive, shackled. Cedar Ridge said something Brindle Mesa could taste. If you can hold them, maybe we can hold ourselves. By noon, men came from the outlying ranches with questions packed into their saddlebags like sandwiches. Their faces had the look men have when pride is deciding whether to admit its admiration. They saw scars on Hale's back when Doc changed the linen and gave him a clean shirt, and saw Rhea with a broom and a book, and a boy who no longer tried to stand where bullets wanted to be. They nodded, as if a sermon had been preached without anyone being accused of heaven. Cade did not try to break the jail that day. 2 of his men did. Rope and temper cured them of the itch. Wade Hawkins asked Harlan to let him bring the circuit. Judge Coffey when he arrived, like a man measuring what gratitude looks like in public. Harlan said yes and smiled when he said it, and some woman watching said he had never looked so much like a sheriff. At dusk, the town met because towns that have nearly burned wish to sit near each other and smell their singeing together. They used the church not because it was holy, but because it had benches, and because people need to see a roof hold to believe they can too. Harlan spoke first. He did it well, because practice is half of speaking sense. He named names, who had carried buckets and who had carried guns, who had thrown matches and who had caught them, who had taken a blow for a boy he didn't father, and who had swallowed blood without spitting fear into a neighbor's face. He did not say hero. He said useful. Rhea liked that word better. It made more men's shoulders straighten. Then people asked what came next. Towns always do. They want steps shaped like stairs to walk down together. Next, Rhea said, standing. When no one else found sentences, we tie ourselves correct. We make a fund. She held up her ledger. This book will have 2 covers now, one for the usual. You all know the drill, and you know I don't lose a number. The room laughed in relief at the familiar boast. The other for the unusual. We'll write down who needs what, and we'll pay it as a town, not as charity, as wages in arrears for the work we did today to keep each other alive. She looked at Bellamy. You can keep the cash box if your fingers behave. I'll keep it with clean hands, he said, almost proud. Next, she went on, we make a watch, not a posse. A watch. We schedule nights, so Harlan sleeps, and so the rest of us learn what our street sounds like when nothing's wrong. That way we hear it early when something is. She saw gratitude in Harlan's face that he would later pretend was only about the practicalities. She let him save the pretense and accepted the truth underneath. Next, she said, we decide to stay. That's work too. Men like Cade want moving targets. We'll plant our feet. Next, she said, because she wasn't done, we pay my note by harvest, and then we start in on yours and yours and yours, not because the bank is a charity, but because a town that owes itself makes a better wall than any man. She heard her father in her mouth when she said that and decided she didn't mind. No one asked about Hale. They looked at him the way you look at a generous river. You don't elect it to a post. You build your fields where it can help, and you try not to drown in the spring. He sat in the aisle, shoulder stiff, eyes steady, a man at church who had already done his day's praying by hammering and bleeding and not killing. Briggs Leary stood and grunted and said words that came out like gravel shaped into sentences. I talk too much for a man who cusses this much, he said. But I'll say this, I was wrong earlier. I wanted powder. Turns out I needed to shut up and carry buckets when you told me to, Rhea. Sheriff, I'll do that again if you tell me where my hands go. That's all we ever needed, Rhea said. Hands in the right places. After the meeting, in the soft dark outside, Hale found her without sounding like a man finding anything. He stood close enough that she could smell the smoke still in his hair. You made them sing, he said. She tipped her head back to look at him. He had shaved badly. His cheeks had missed 2 places. She would have laughed any other day. Today, her throat found gratitude instead. You made them quiet enough to hear, she said. He considered that like a craftsman considers new tools. Stay, he said. She blinked, caught by the single syllable's reach. Stay where? She asked, careful to not let hope gallop where only a mule should walk. He gestured at the world. Here, in it, with me watching. He was not asking her to love him. He was offering something bigger and smaller, a perimeter. It was the best thing he knew how to give. I was going to, she said, and let herself lean closer by the width of a coin, which in some economies is the cost of bread, and in others the cost of a life-changing direction. 2 days later, the judge came and took a long look at what Brindle Mesa had done to itself and for itself, and decided that justice could be improved upon by the participation of those who had bled for it. The trial took a day. Cade spoke for himself, because of course he did. He called no witnesses, then called everyone in the room good company. He smiled a lot, and meant none of it, and some of it at the same time. He pled guilty to 3 things, not guilty to 7, and told a story that was good enough to make a few men shift their weight and a few women shake their heads. The judge sentenced him to 20 years and said a prayer over it, as if he believed prayers needed to be heard by the same men who needed to hear sentences. When the deputies from Carson City came to collect Cade and the worst of his men, Cade asked for his cuffs to be tightened the way a man asks for a coat as he leaves a party. He looked at Rhea one last time and grinned. You going to miss me? He asked. No, she said. He laughed. Good. I'd hate to be ordinary. He glanced at Hale. You are many things, Smith, none of them ordinary. Try not to get bored. If you do, for God's sake, don't come where I am. Hale didn't answer. The deputies led Cade away, and the town felt larger and smaller all at once, the way a house feels after guests leave. Cleaner, emptier, somehow more like itself than it was the day before. Rhea rebuilt the counter one board at a time with Gabe's impatient hands at her elbow. Hale planed the top edge for her, because a man who could read wind could read pine. Doc Green checked Hale's back every morning and clucked, then stopped clucking and started telling stories about the time he'd cut a barbed wire barb out of his own thumb and eaten a biscuit afterward, because that's what the body wants. When it finishes doing something stupid and brave at once, Harlan slept. He learned how, and the town learned how to let him. On his nights off, he walked with Liddy Moffat's little girl because she had decided he needed a child to hold one of his fingers and keep him from falling over into his pride again. He let her. It looked good on him. Bellamy kept the new ledger without cheating. Sometimes he lingered over the column that counted what people owed each other and touched it like a man touches the place a ring used to sit. Rhea thought he might have fallen in love with that column. She didn't stop him. Wade Hawkins came back quiet one morning and put $2 on the counter and wouldn't say why. Rhea took the money and didn't ask, because you don't interrogate. And a man, on the day he learns how to pay a debt you didn't write, Evan, the boy who had held a bottle on his head like a dare, came to the feed store without his pride and bought oats with money that shook in his hand. "For a horse I don't deserve," he muttered. "But I'm trying." She gave him a penny back and took nothing for the trying. He cried at the trough later and hoped nobody saw. Hale saw. He pretended he didn't. Sometimes, when the afternoon went quiet in that good way that makes a town feel like it's breathing in tasty air, Rhea walked to the forge. Hale would hand her a stool without looking, and she would watch the way he made stubborn things submit and think, this is the right use of force. He would pause once in a while and look at her hands on her lap, ink-stained, scarred, strong in ways that didn't announce themselves, and she would feel an answering pause move through his shoulders. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. Quiet can be a country if you settle it with the right person. One evening, standing under the eave where rain had the decency to pause and think before falling, she told him, "I used to think safety was a number, enough coins to not be moved by other people's appetites. He waited, which was another form of love. Now I think safety is a person," she said. "A set of hands that know where to stand, a town that knows where to put its fear, a ledger that doesn't forget faces." He nodded. It felt like a covenant. "I can watch," he said again, and she shook her head once, not disagreeing, but expanding. "We can," she said. Summer went on. "The cottonwoods did the thing they do where they pretend to be snow and make children wild with pretending. The church bell rang only when it was supposed to. The bank stopped being a threat and went back to being a building. The feed store smelled like new rope and old oats and a promise. People passed each other and said afternoon and meant it. Once a stranger came and asked if the rumors were true about a smith who didn't speak and still managed to make a town say what it needed to. Rhea told him the rumor was missing the important parts. The ledger, the buckets, the boy who learned to set a gun down when he didn't know what to do with it. The stranger said he'd mention those in the next place. She hoped he would. What men said in other towns about Brindle Mesa a season later rarely mentioned Rhea by name. They talked about the blacksmith, because legends like to throw their weight into men who looked the part. But when wives pulled their husbands' chairs closer to the stove and asked for the story, the women who had filled buckets and made lines and kept the bread from staling were the ones who spoke Rhea's name. It moved along kitchen tables like a happy rumor. That was enough. On a slow Tuesday, a letter came addressed to Rhea in a hand like fence posts. It was from Cedar Ridge. Inside a short note, "We heard what you did with the ledger. We're doing it too." It had 2 signatures and 8 thumbprints. She tacked it to the wall behind her counter, where anybody paying for nails could read it. Hale stood in the doorway and looked at it a long time, with his hands in his pockets and his mouth making the smallest motion that could be called a smile. That night, Rhea wrote another line in her second book. What we owe each other. Ongoing. Interest, hope. She closed the ledger. She blew out the lamp. The street was soft. Somewhere Gabe laughed the new way boys laugh when they've learned they will not die this week. Somewhere, Harlan said goodnight to a woman he was not yet brave enough to declare he would die for. and went home to sleep like a man whose body had learned what rest could buy. Somewhere, Bellamy checked a lock and felt honest satisfaction instead of fear. Hale waited on the boardwalk, a silhouette the town had learned, and walked her home. He didn't carry a gun. He didn't need to. He carried something else, a steadiness that made corridors of dark into rooms. At her gate, he said, "Rhea." She turned. He opened his mouth, and for once she did not rush the future by filling the space his silence made. When he spoke, it was a word-sized sentence that would keep them busy a year finding the rest of it. "Stay," he said again. "I am," she answered, and the gate clicked behind her in a way that sounded like a pen finishing a line. The town slept. The silent Smith watched. The ledger stayed balanced exactly enough for what came next, and somewhere far south, where roads braid into each other and men can get lost on purpose, a voice in a jail cell sang to itself about a horse that loved, a man better than the man deserved, and a town that loved itself enough to not need a song to know what it was. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.